As the COVID-19 pandemic spread to Pakistan, Aga Khan University Hospital promptly adapted to the situation to successfully treat the afflicted patients. When most of the city was shut down, AKU continued its operations to control this unseen and unheard of virus. We faced the situation with determination and a focus on using digital solutions to keep patients, students, and staff as safe as possible. We redesigned processes to efficiently admit and discharge COVID patients and enable data-driven decision-making to ensure smooth throughput. We also implemented work from home by securing VPN facilities for faculty, staff, and students so they could continue to work through Microsoft Teams and Zoom. We also facilitated the virtual global convocation.
During the COVID-19 crisis, our patients were not able to come to the hospital, and that's where we provided them the facility of Family Hifazat, which is a patient app. Our patients were able to use those facilities to book their appointments, to pay online, to request for lab tests and pharmacy medications. AKU IT introduced Check app for our employees to report health-related issues and to monitor their quarantine during the pandemic. AKU also introduced Travel Check app for airlines so that we can publish PCR COVID test results for travelers and airlines can get access to those results seamlessly.
Furthermore, we established tele-ICU facilities in hospitals across the country by establishing communication channels to allow physicians to speak with our ICU experts for queries related to COVID. The ICT department played the role of enablers and responded beyond its bandwidth to combat the impact of COVID. We were able to bring effective initiatives that helped us ensure safety and access to healthcare for our patients, students, and employees. Teamwork in times of uncertainty allowed us to realize our potential of working above and beyond in the face of this pandemic.
Hello and welcome to everyone on this webinar. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you for taking the time to join us today as we explore the digital transformation in Estonia. This special lecture has been organized by the Aga Khan University, the University of Central Asia, and the CXO Global Forum. My name is Shaukat Ali Khan, and I'm the CIO of the Aga Khan University. It is my great privilege today to host His Excellency Toomas Ilves, former President of Estonia, a leading country in digital governance. He currently sits as co-chair of Global Future Council on Blockchain Technology. I would also like to mention that members of the CIO Executive Network are also joining me to moderate this special lecture today. Toomas Ilves is renowned for making Estonia one of the most digitally advanced nations through innovative policies that invested heavily in the future. Estonia has led the way in this space, offering government e-services in voting, banking, healthcare, transportation, and education. A decade before his presidency, Toomas introduced initiatives such as the Tiger Leaf program for Estonian schools to equip them with computer labs and to get them all online. In his time serving in the government in various roles, including Estonia's ambassador to the United States and Minister of Foreign Affairs, he steered Estonia successfully into the EU and NATO in 2004. He was elected to the European Parliament in 2004, where he served as Vice Chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee. He ran for the presidency of Estonia as a joint candidate of the Social Democratic, Conservative, and Liberal parties and was elected in 2006 and re-elected in 2011. We are privileged that Toomas is joining us today to share his wealth of experience and wisdom. We hope to hear him share his perspective on digital transformation, why it is important, what are the challenges, and how the digital agenda may evolve over coming years. Toomas will speak for around 30 minutes, after which we will take a few questions from the leading CIOs of the country. With great respect, Toomas, over to you.
Okay, well, I will try to speak in sort of half an hour about how Estonia got to where it was. First of all, just for background, Estonia is a very small country, especially compared to Pakistan. We were an independent country, but we were occupied by the Soviet Union in 1940, and we became independent again in 1991. To give you an idea of how great the change was for the negative, in 1938, our northern neighbor Finland had a lower GDP per capita than Estonia. In 1992, which was the first year we were full independence, the GDP per capita of Finland was 8 times the GDP per capita of Estonia. So we were very, I mean, while the rest of Europe became quite developed, we were stuck. And in that period, of course, we did have some computer skills, but in general, the economy was in terrible shape. GDP per capita was $2,800. So that was where we were. And it looked pretty bleak. I mean, what are we going to do? How do we get out of this? And especially, how do we get out of Zeno's paradox? If you recall, Zeno's paradox has Hercules running after a turtle, but he never catches up because the turtle's still always moving ahead. And that's the same problem with development. And so there are various solutions and people had different ideas. But my background was that I had learned to code or program when I was 15 years old. And so, by this time I was already 40. And so I thought, well, one way of, as a result of learning to code, I never felt afraid of anything that had to do with computers. Shortly thereafter, when I went to university, excuse me, let's see how this connection is doing here. 1 second.
It is connected, Toomas.
Yeah, no, everything's fine. Everything's fine. In university, I ended up programming in assembler language. So this was all in the 1970s. But what happened was that I was no longer fearful of coding. Now, jump many years ahead, and we were sitting there, where do we go with Estonia? And I had, two things happened. One was that I just recalled my own experiences learning to digitize, and I was convinced already, or rather learning how to code, and I was already then convinced this would be the wave of the future. But secondly, in 1993, Mosaic came out, which was the first web browser. And back then you had to buy it for something like $30 and upload 7 floppy disks in order to do at all have a web browser, but it was only the first. I looked at this and I said, here's one area where we can compete, where we're on a level playing field. Everything else, the developed world is far ahead of us. They've had 50 years of investment. They've had the Marshall Plan. They've had they've had the European Union, but we didn't have anything. And so I proposed that we put computers in every single school and connect them all, which met with some opposition. But ultimately we achieved that. And by 1998, all Estonian schools were online, which, as it turned out, had a huge effect on creating a whole. Every generation since then has been computer savvy. Now, all of that led to an understanding at the end of the 90s that the usual computer systems that were being used would not offer us the kind of security that you would need in a digital society. And we concluded that we need to deal with three basic issues. The first thing that we need to do is to have a secure and unique identity. This is something that, for example, countries like the United States to this day do not have. They do not offer a national ID, and even within Europe, it's in almost all countries, it's a digital identity is optional. What do I mean by secure digital identity? It means you have two-factor authentication, which means that you need to have something you possess or have in your hands, and something you know. This is opposed to one-factor authentication, which is the standard method used in most transactions, where you just have an email address and a password. That's not good enough, because those can all be hacked and often are. Two-factor authentication gives you a much higher level of security. And the second thing that you have to do for this to work is to have end-to-end encryption, so you can't have any man-in-the-middle attacks during your transaction. So this was a major step. The crucial political step in this is that we made this mandatory. If you do not make a digital identity mandatory for people, you will find that you have an uptake rate of 15 to 25%, depending on the country, mainly early adopters and people who like tech, but the rest of the population won't take it up. What this leads to is that government agencies and ministries look at the numbers and they say, well, why should we invest in digital services if, after all, 85% of the population doesn't have a digital identity? And then it works the other way as well. The 15 to 25% that have gone out and gotten themselves a digital identity find that they don't get anything for their efforts because the ministries have not invested in any services. So that's a crucial political decision you have to make. The second thing we decided to do was to have a distributed data exchange layer, which meant that we don't have a single central database. That is, again, hugely important for security, as we've seen over the past 20 years, that if you have a single database that has everything, if you get in, you suck everything out. I mean, the best known one is the OPM hack in the United States. That's the Office of Personnel Management, where the personal data of 23 million federal employees, government employees, in other words, were sucked out because they were all held in one place. And this included this has the addresses and phone numbers of everybody who ever worked for the US government, current addresses, at least at that time. And even in the case of, say, people working at CIA, their psychological profiles were stolen, everything. But we decided to have a distributed data exchange layer, which at the time, every ministry and agency kept their own servers, and to access them, you still needed to go through the authentication and verification process of a digital identity. Today, we keep all of that information in the cloud. Back then, the cloud was only beginning, and we didn't. So we had basically agencies and ministries kept their servers, but access was limited strictly via the verification authentication system. So those two were really where we started off. Later on, a third pillar came into security, which is something that very few countries have done, but is absolutely necessary for digitization of any kind of services, but especially government services, is to protect the integrity of the data. Data, especially in Europe, there's an obsession with privacy, which is fine. I have nothing against privacy, but privacy is actually a minor problem compared to data integrity. And if you think about it, well, privacy is if someone finds out my and publishes, say, my blood type or my bank account or whatever it is that you want to keep private. Integrity, however, is if someone changes my data. Now, if someone changes my blood type or the record of my blood type, that can have fatal consequences for me should I ever go to a hospital. If someone changes my bank account, it's unlikely they will change my bank account to be better or bigger. Most likely they will simply take the money. So data integrity is highly important. Those are the three pillars that must be met really by any kind of digitization of public services. So secure, unique identity. No one else has that identity. A distributed data exchange layer, which guarantees that you cannot steal the whole database. You can, at worst, take one kind of information for one person, but that's it. And finally, data integrity. Where this has led to in Estonia is that currently all can do everything that involves the government online, except for two things. You can't get married online and you can't get divorced online. You must show up for those two. Everything else. Until recently, you couldn't do property transfers either, but we have built a very robust system that will allow you to actually not show up physically, but be digitally present to go through property transfers, buying or selling land, for example, which is a crucial issue these days in countries where all kinds of anonymous shell companies with anonymous beneficial owners buy things. I mean, the best known example of this is sort of the assistance of Russia's leading mafioso bought apartments in Trump Tower. We don't want to get into those kind of situations, frankly. What this leads to when I say where all services are digital is an enormous, huge, I mean, inestimable advance in quality of government services. We have a dramatic decrease in corruption. In the corruption risk analysis or statistics put out by an organization that does corruption risk for businesses, we are the 6th least corrupt country in the world after Finland, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, New Zealand. We're 6th. Now, this is when former communist countries remain largely notoriously corrupt. This has a huge effect on petty corruption. Petty corruption is the problem that you run into where you need to pay your someone from the public will have to pay for an elementary service provided by the government to a civil servant. So if you want to see a doctor, if you want to get your pension, whatever, you have to give a certain percentage to the civil servant. Once you go digital, this problem disappears, and I mean, it leads to a different problem that many governments pay their civil servants very little, assuming that they will take money from the public. So one hindrance, curiously enough, to eliminating corruption is having to raise the salaries of civil servants, but I'll leave that aside for now. Where we are is that, I mean, is exemplified by Estonia versus the United States. When I was teaching at Stanford after I left office, and I had to register my daughter to go to school. In order to register for her to go to school, I had to get my electricity bill, which proved that I lived where I lived. I had to drive to the headquarters of the school district, wait there in the waiting room for 20 minutes, and then go and present to an official or a bureaucrat my passport, my visa, my electricity bill, passport or birth certificate of my daughter, and then something silly called the DS 2019 form, which showed that I actually was employed by Stanford. And so the person took all these papers and went off somewhere for 10 minutes and made photocopies of them, came back, and then proceeded to copy by hand the information in my documentation. Now in Estonia, I don't do any of that. Because the information is there, where I live, my children, where I'm employed. All of that is known, and it's processed automatically and digitally, which means that it all is very fast. One reason why things are become very fast and efficient and far more secure is that digitization of this type, especially with the distributed data exchange layer, leads to a complete revolution in the way bureaucracy has run ever since it was invented, be it in China 5,000 years ago, or Mesopotamia, or Egypt, wherever. Because up till now, bureaucracy has always proceeded on a medium of paper or clay, or in the worst cases, even PDFs, but it leads to a serial or sequential process. You go to an office, you hand in a paper, the paper goes somewhere else, another official takes the paper, looks at it, checks up to see if it's right, puts a stamp on it, goes to the next place. The good example of this is how a birth happens in Estonia, which or is registered, which was explained to me by the man who designed it, who his first child was born under the old system, and he said he went crazy running to the population registry, the vital statistics office, the health insurance company, his local government. Now what happens, or what he redesigned the system because he never wanted to do it again. So the way it works is when a child is born, the hospital or doctor will ask what is the child's name and sends it to the population registry, which then issues the child an ID, and an ID number informs the Bureau of Vital Statistics that then puts in, issues a birth certificate, also informs the health insurance company that this child is now insured because it's the child of insured parents, and also notifies my local government that there is a new additional citizen living in that town or village. All of that happens automatically. So if you think of all of these complex processes that take a long time, either on the government side, the supply side, or on the part of the citizen, as in the case of the computer engineer who ran from office to office to office, which is the demand side. All of these things are done automatically, and that's where the corruption reduction comes in, of course, because these are automated processes. We are now working on incorporating artificial intelligence into the system so that, in fact, the government will inform you that maybe you ought to do this or maybe you ought to do that, that your driver's license is going to expire soon, you should reapply, or your passport will go out, or in one case in fact, you have additional benefits you have not applied for, please apply. So this is how digitization has proceeded in my country since we instituted this system in the year 2000, 2001. One particular aspect of this system that works extremely well is the so-called once only rule, which is the government may not ask you any information it already has, because all of the information is tied one way or another to your unique identity. That means you never have to fill out your address, your phone number, whatever it is that you have to fill out in government forms. This saves basically millions of hours of work by bureaucrats. And we calculate that digitization has saved us or given us an additional 2% of GDP a year, which is quite substantial, I would say. So that is sort of the basic form of what we do. Of course, the system has developed considerably since we first enacted it. But what is noteworthy is that it is highly secure and is robust, to the point that the private sector prefers to use this system to hiring their own or buying their own cybersecurity programs, because it simply is much more secure. And so that in fact the system actually works in a public-private partnership between a consortium of Estonian banks and the government, because the banks find this so much more secure than other systems that they are willing to pay to keep it going together with the government. So that's where we are today. And I mean, I've really compressed the whole talk. Where we will be going is first and foremost to employing domestically AI, proactive AI services, artificial intelligence services to help even more. More importantly, however, is what we need to do, and this is especially a problem for a small country, is to internationalize this. As I said, Europe is not at all nearly as advanced as we are. There are certain fields or certain services that work in Europe fairly well. An example of this is the digital prescription, which we introduced in 2007, which is basically we do not use paper prescriptions for medicines. And I proposed, already 11, 12 years ago to the Finnish president, where Finland also had instituted, using our system, incidentally, the X-Road distributed data exchange layer for prescriptions. And I said, well, you're using our system, we're using the system, why don't we connect them? So we get a lot of Finns. We get 7 million visits from Finns a year, at least pre-COVID. And there only are 5 million Finns, so that gives you an idea of how many Finns visit Estonia. And he said, sure, that's a great idea. But the problem is not technological. And this is one basic thing you have to figure it out. It's not about buying stuff. It's not about having the electronics. The digital solution, the actual technical solution to making digital prescriptions interoperable across borders would have taken a week, 2 weeks, maybe that's it maximum. It took like 8 years to get it to work because of all the bureaucratic and political decisions that had to be made, because the Finns subsidize certain medicines for one age group and a certain amount of subsidy. The Estonians subsidize different medicines maybe for a somewhat different age group. I'm thinking of older people like me, and to a different amount. Hammering and working out those details, which are all about avoiding arbitrage, about sort of, making sure that no one's making extra money going to the other place and buying medicine, all of that took 7 or 8 years to work out. And so this is another sort of important rule to keep in mind, especially because all kinds of McKinsey's and Deloitte's, they will come and say, buy this system, just buy this system. Do not buy what they tell you. You can do it yourself. Pakistan, we have people from Pakistan working in our tech sector. They're really bright. You can invent your own. We give away for free our data exchange layer because it's now been adopted by about 20 countries and further developed. It's all open source, so non-proprietary. The hard part is the legal and legislative side of digitization. And this is where, when I say our next task is to make services available across the European Union. Now, we have gotten to the point where digital prescriptions are interoperable between Estonia and Finland and Portugal and Croatia. I mean, that leaves a lot of other countries. But at least when you go if I go to Portugal and I need my Estonian medicine, I can go to a Portuguese pharmacy and ID myself and verify myself with my digital identity, and I will be able to get my medicine. Ultimately, you want this to work across, at least I want it to work across the European Union. And more importantly, the goal should be that the same is true of health records, so that if I go to Greece, which has a completely different alphabet, completely different language, and I get sick there, I go to a Greek doctor, I identify, verify myself, and then authorize that doctor to access my medical records, which are in Estonian, in Estonia. He can access them and they will appear magically on his screen, translated into Greek. That should work across the continent. Ultimately, that should work across the world, but I mean, it's a long way off, right? Anyway, that's the future. I would argue, in closing, since I see that I've been speaking for a half an hour here, that if transport infrastructure, building major highways, was the fundamental task of Europe and the United States and much of the rest of the world in the second half of the 20th century. So from 1950 to 2000, countries, including mine, we still keep doing it because we had such bad transport infrastructure, devoted to developing that infrastructure. I argue that the first half, at least, that's as far as I can foresee. I won't live much beyond that. In fact, I don't think I'll get that far. But the real task of countries in the first half of the 21st century is to develop the public service infrastructure, digital services, digital public services. The private sector will develop all of these things to sell you stuff, but in terms of government services, which in the case of most countries are digitally far, far, far behind the private sector in security and quality of services, will be the task that governments around the world will face. And in fact, I would argue that this, in the first half of this century, the countries that are digitized will experience much faster growth, better health, greater prosperity than those countries that choose not to digitize. Thank you. And now I'll answer all your questions.
Thank you very much, Toomas, for sharing your perspective on the digital transformation on country level. I think there's so much to learn from all of us. And I think the great part is that you mentioned about the electronic medical record. We at the Al Khan University at the moment, that's our biggest investment project we are running in 6 countries, where we are automating all our digital records across the countries. Actually, okay, thank you very much, Thomas. As I mentioned earlier, we are joined today by a number of CIOs from national and international organizations, many with a strong presence here in Pakistan. What advice do you have for today's population of chief information officers or tech leaders, particularly those in less developed countries, as they look to lead the digital transformation agenda for their own organizations?
Well, I mean, I think I would argue that there are no hindrances based on size that have to do with technology. You simply need more server room. I mean, that's the I would say the problems may come in politically, because just that if you have a smaller country, it just is the nature of legislation and political process that you can end up finding consensus more quickly in smaller countries than in larger countries. And it seems that if you look at very large countries, it's hard to find political consensus, at least in democratic large countries. Where that's the advantage of size, but there is no advantage there is no competitive advantage based on technology that has to do with size, because it ultimately just means you have to issue more IDs, and you need to have bigger server space, and you need to probably have more numbers in your ID. That's it. I mean, the technological side remains the same, basically. So I'm not. I mean, I think the size issue when it comes to technology is not serious. It may be serious in countries just looking at how they proceed. A problem with political consensus. So, in fact, all of the countries it's curious that the countries that have done most to digitize public services are small countries. Large countries seem to be much slower in this regard, though it may also have to do with a sense of self-importance in some cases. I won't mention some large countries, but there are some very large countries that may be highly advanced technologically in the private sector, but don't quite think that they don't have to do the public sector. Well, I mean, one example I would say is the United States. During COVID, I remember reading it was when COVID had been there for 3 months. And one of the first things the US federal government did was it stopped issuing and renewing passports. So they had by June of 2020, they had a backlog of 7 million passports not issued or renewed. This was never a problem in my country. I mean, you do all of that digitally. So you can think of, that one simple case, just because there was an article in the New York Times about it, but just, copied over and over and over to all kinds of other areas of public services, be they driver's license renewals or application for welfare services. I mean, all of that stopped in the US, which you think is the most advanced country digitally. And I mean, of course, Silicon Valley is the world capital of IT. All of the great innovations come out of there, but not in public services, where I would say the level of public services is abysmal.
Thank you, Thomas. It's interesting. A couple of questions from the room. I would request you to just introduce yourself, and then you can ask your question. Shahid?
Yeah, hi, Thomas. This is Shahid Said here. I'm the CIO of National Foods, which is an FMCG company here. Just wanted to understand that you made the shift to computerization very early, so it seems your population is more computer savvy. What did you do in terms of infrastructure? Like we've been experiencing internet connectivity here issues. I'm not sure if it was partially on your side or on our side. And for all of this information that's flowing between institutions, you must have a pretty secure and stable and reliable infrastructure. What did the government do there? Or did it leave it to the private companies?
Well, part of it, initially, we actually made a deal with a telecom company that they would, instead of selling them, privatizing our telecom, our state-owned telecom, they would have to build out the fiber network in the country. And that put us that created the initial sort of build out, because it was cheap for them, but it was also, I mean, yeah, I think the money was better spent, or I don't think we would have spent the money on something as smart as fiber optics if we hadn't made that deal. Since then, of course, we have, that was already done in the 90s. And since then, because of changing population patterns, because of population growth in some places and so forth, we have continued to build out the fiber optic infrastructure with government funds. And of course, the big problem there is always the last mile or the last kilometer. And since we have low population density, then there are people who live way out in the woods and they still don't have that connection. So we offer an air connection via 4G, but that's still not as good as a solid fiber connection. One way or another, you're going to have to spend money on that. Without it, well, the digitization doesn't work. It's a sine qua non for digitization.
Thank you, Toomas. We have another question here.
Yes, Thomas, this is Jalal Jafri, I'm Group CIO of Untitled, which is a leading pharmaceutical group in Pakistan. We have like 4 manufacturing plants in Pakistan, 2 manufacturing plants in Europe. Thank you very much, first of all, for the detailed overview of digitalization, how is it helped in Estonia in various aspects. You covered very well when it comes to overall healthcare industry, but in particular, I would want to know how digitalization helped pharmaceutical industry in terms of doing business in the country, from clinical trial, development of the products, and to the market. So do we have any such case study in where digitalization has actually helped pharmaceutical industry in terms of doing business in the country? Thank you.
Well, I mean, we don't really have a serious pharmaceutical industry in Estonia. I mean, aside from aspirin, maybe, but that's not serious. So, I mean, really, the main place where the pharmaceutical industry is connected to us, and they love our digital prescription system. They think it's because it's all retail. It's not wholesale, it's retail, but they just love the efficiencies which come with digitization, especially when it comes to, the negative side of handwritten prescriptions. And I remember reading that 5,000 people die a year in the United States from misread prescriptions, badly written out by the doctor, where the handwriting is unclear and you get the wrong medicine or the wrong dosage. We don't have that problem because 99.9% of prescriptions are digital. No one bothers with, and you don't have a doc line. So that's, so I know that pharmaceutical companies, now every.
Thank you, Toomas. We have another question here. Are you with us at the moment? Can you hear us?
Yeah. Yes.
Yes.
Hi Thomas, this is Atif Najam. I am the Group CIO for Gatron Novotex Group, which is a company dealing in plastics as well as textile. My question is how you manage the change management part of this technology transfer, because the major part is people using this technology and actually utilizing it. So how you actually manage the change management area?
The question is how you manage the change management element of technology when you are rolling out big transformation projects.
Well, things haven't, we haven't run out of them. We keep trying to improve them. This is the, as I said, we've shifted focus, obviously, but now we're really focusing on first on implementation of artificial intelligence for government services to make them more efficient and especially proactive. Secondly, what has happened is that I mean, we're trying to simplify procedures. Initially, when we rolled it out, the user interfaces were clunky, but that's what we deal with. I mean, it's and of course, there's one thing, however, that is really important that I neglected to mention. Where digital differs from all other infrastructure projects is that OPEX, or operational expenditures, are vastly different from CAPEX or capital expenditures in their nature. You know, when governments are used to paying for roads and buildings and whatever fiber optics, you make an investment and then it stays there. I mean, maybe you might fix a road that has gotten a little old, but basically once you spend a huge amount of money in a year and you build the road or you lay the fiber optics, you don't really worry about it anymore. In digital, it's very different. You constantly have to upgrade, update, renew, and that costs money. That is the budgetary problem of digital that you need to face and explain to your finance minister or your chief finance officer that it's not like buying a building, or a highway. It is, you have to keep pumping money into it, otherwise the system can be attacked, there'll be new vulnerabilities, and so you have to think very differently financially about these things. Let me just add one thing here, because I see a question about what did you do about citizens who couldn't and wouldn't access digital services, because I think that's an important issue. In the 1990s, we realized that we were poor, so people didn't have computers at home back then. Now we're a lot richer, and 90% of Estonian households have a PC or a laptop at home. Back then we didn't. So what we did was we put computer rooms, computer banks in every municipal government building. And hired people who would assist whoever wanted to use them. So since banks support, this was a public-private partnership and an initiative, because banks clearly preferred the far more secure computer banking, and also it meant they could close local banks because those cost a lot of money. And so we've had since the late sort of 1999, 2000, we've had the public internet access points in every village, which went a long way to actually assisting the digitization of the country. We also put in, to make it, in addition to that, every local or municipal government also has a free Wi-Fi spot. So I've even used it where I needed to send something and I I was driving in my car. So I drove to a local government building, I parked outside it, opened my computer, got on Wi-Fi and sent a mail that I had to send by a certain time. So these things work.
Thank you, Thomas. I think this was the question from the CIO from Pakistan International Airline, who was sitting in one of the panels. So I've received a question from the government of Sindh that thank you for such a crisp and very insightful talk. I worked with government of Sindh and would like to know your opinion on changing the behavior of people, since one of the challenges faced by digital services is that it has to be coupled with nudges to the users for reminding them to apply for their driving license expiring or submitting their tax returns and other public services. How did Estonia resolve this challenge?
Well, basically, all our taxes are done digitally. I mean, no one files income tax with on paper, and we the same. And this also, I mean, more broadly, we have all VAT. And I don't know if you have VAT in Pakistan, but value-added tax, where you all those returns, which those are have to be done digitally, and any transaction over, I think, 750 euros, which is about $750, must be filed digitally. You cannot use paper for that. And what this allows, does an enormous job of cutting down on tax fraud, because usually what happens is that companies claim much more, or small companies especially claim much more VAT than they actually have bought, and then they get money back from their VAT from the government. I mean, the digitization of taxation is a whole big realm, and I would suggest if you want to get into the weeds on this, if you go to www.ega.ee, which is the e-Governance Academy, which is a non-profit organization, non-governmental organization that advises governments on digitization of public services. So I'll repeat it: www.ega, which stands for e-Governance Academy, like Khan Academy, but EGA and .ee. If you write to them and tell them you are interested in a certain issue, they will respond and they will do whatever they think they can do. Either have, say, the government of Sindh come to, or someone, CIO of Sindh, come to Estonia. They might send someone out. I don't know. This is what we do in order to help countries and local governments, I mean, at different levels, digitize public services.
Thank you, Thomas. So we only have 5 minutes, and then we can just take 2 more questions. So yes, you can ask them, and then the last one.
Thomas, thank you. This is Wasim Rashid from Tapalti, the tea company, consumer goods company. So my question is, what's your strategy for cloud services, especially e-government? You host it inside or outside? You know, we come across Ukraine case, right? So e-government services, your cloud data, you're hosting inside your Estonia, or what strategy we are facing same problem here.
I'm not sure I understand what's the question again?
So the question is about the cloud strategy, about hosting government data. Whether is it hosted in Estonia, or have you also explored options outside Estonia?
Yes, it depends on the nature of the service, really, actually, because cloud services for non-critical issues, it doesn't really matter. We use Microsoft cloud services with an additional layer that we put in ourselves. on data integrity, using keyless signature infrastructure, and then the say national defense things are local or domestic. It really depends on the nature of the services. What are people nervous about? People are not nervous about most services, but sort of those which are tied to national security are domestic.
Thank you, Thomas. We will take the last question, Ambassador.
Thank you very much. My name is Jamil Khan, and I'm the former ambassador of Pakistan to UAE, Libya, and Malta. First of all, thank you very much. It was such an insightful deliberations that we have really learned a lot from your this complete talks. My question is that your GDP, if I remember it correctly, is about 35,000 US dollars. And the transition from, I think, much lower once you took over as a president, Your Excellency.
2,800.
Yes. Yeah, only 800. So now we are at the stage where we are between 13,000 to 14,000. And I was just thinking to listen to your thoughts about it. How did you do that transformation, and to what extent the this digital transformation helped you in propelling this the GDP of your country? And my just another very brief point is that the resistance which we have found in various societies about the digitalization to start with. So how did you deal with that resistance to passive acceptance to actually active acceptance? Thank you very much, Your Excellency.
Well, on the second question, really you have to start off with services that people like. So, I mean, things that make life easier, that increases the acceptance rate dramatically. People hate filling out their taxes. If you fill out your taxes digitally, you don't even fill them out. They're filled out for you by the government. I mean, you can sort of revise them, obviously, and check them, but anyway, people trust them. So if you offer services that people like, then you will end up with a halo effect. Sort of things will spread to other services and lead to uptake there. So that's, I mean, the problem is that you know, the governments, when they digitize, they often want to do things that make their own life easier. But what you really need to focus on is on those services that make your citizens' life easier. And that is a key to getting acceptance. So, I mean, things that have massive uptake, such as digital prescriptions or filing taxes, are things that people like a lot. And that makes them, or it gives them the skills to use on other issues. And that's where the acceptance comes in. It doesn't come in immediately. It takes a few years, but certainly by now, the country, or I'd say for at least a decade and a half, the population is digital. Now, the first question was, how did we increase GDP? Well, I mean, it's kind of, I mean, it's a very complex thing. I mean, we also have the highest level of unicorns per capita in the world. I mean, we have a unicorn basically for every 160,000 people. It's $1 billion company. Now, we wouldn't have them unless we had all these people who were young in the 1990s who got involved in doing computer stuff. I mean, that was when I finished my term, I went around to various startups, some of which now are also billion-dollar companies, and I would ask them, so how'd you get started, and why do you have your own company? And said, well, I was a kid in that program you had 20 years ago, and that's how I got hooked, and I've been doing it ever since. So that's one thing. So, I mean, we do have a lot of very good and rich companies in Estonia. That helps. This, of course, fuels investment in the country. The low corruption rate also makes us a very attractive country for FDI. All of those kind of work together. There you develop a synergy. If we used to be considered just another former communist backwater, now our image, our public image, our brand, if you will, is of a dynamic, fast-moving, highly developed society. And that transformation has taken, well, 30 years, and also is a result of many factors, but clearly digitization is a key factor among those.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for your time and for sharing your experience and the wealth of knowledge. So we are really, really grateful, and it's a privilege for all of us to hear you. And then thank you I would like to thank all the audience who are there and then who are listening, who are participating this session. A recording of this lecture will be available on the YouTube channels shortly of all host partners, the Al University, the University of Central Asia, and then the CXO Global Forum. So once again, our sincere thanks and appreciation to the former president, His Excellency Toomas Ilves. Thank you very much and have a very nice day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.